the bell has rung. So get seated and join Elementary Schooled for today's interview.
I would like to thank Utah Entity Services for being a contributor to this podcast. And if I can just point you into the direction of Alicia Scow, she is an amazing paralegal who can help you create an LLC on the side. She does LLCs for both real property, such as rental properties, Airbnbs, investment properties, and also with your business. Welcome to Elementary School. This is Season 2, Episode 7. And before we get rolling, I would like to thank listeners for contributing to helping pay off school lunch money debt, especially for 2 schools here in Utah, Stansbury Park Elementary and also Old Mill Elementary out of Twilla. And I want to thank listeners for your contributions. It has meant a great deal, and it is still going. So if you'd like to contribute, you can always contact your local district. But if you want to make it easy and you still want to contribute to what we're doing, go to Venmo at Elementary School, or you can go directly to their district site at successfund.com. And both of those links will be put in the show notes. Today, we are going raw and real. Thanks, Justin, for your patience. I like to cover any topic that affects the elementary age child, and this topic's been requested many times. The only reason I didn't want to do it is because it's very personal to me, but then I realized that's probably the reason I should cover the topic. And so today we are talking about how to legally protect your kids through the process of divorce. And I'll talk a little bit about how it affects your child in the classroom, but our focus is going to be helped immensely today by someone I really appreciate who has advocated for my family. And so I want to welcome you, Cragun Berube.
Hey, Melanie, thanks for having me.
I really appreciate your time because you are a busy, busy person. You're fighting the good fight.
Well, we're doing our best, but it's honestly a privilege to know great people like you and be able to step up and help not only people, but kids. I mean, it's a lot of this comes from decisions that the kids haven't necessarily made and they're impacted by it. And so just trying to do our best out there. And so thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to having a little chat with you and having a little chat with your listeners, and hopefully we can provide some valuable information for you.
Thank you. We're going to cover a lot. Justin, you are a family law attorney with Farr, Cragun, and Berube. And for full disclosure, you are my attorney, and you have been my attorney since 2019. You were the 3rd attorney that our family worked with. I was about halfway through my experience of being a respondent in domestic court. So for anyone that's going through that, you know what that means. We'll talk about that a little bit. I did nearly 7 years in domestic court, and to be completely transparent, it is one of the driving forces as to why, as a teacher here in Utah, that I decided to start this podcast. My number one was I got tired of hearing there was a crisis in the classroom when there's so much good happening behind the scenes. And number 2 was during those 7 years, I started going to other people's hearings that were in similar situations and listening and paying attention. And I just had this little flame kind of growing inside of me of how what I found very disappointing and troubling is the kids' voices really in the experiences that I've been a part of. And I know that's limited, but the kids' voices are not heard. And just like you already said, there are a lot of circumstances that families go through that the kids have the least amount of control, and they're the ones suffering. And just a little clip about the classroom. It does, just like any family issue or whatever's happening medically or any kind of crisis or whatever family's going through, kids do bring that stuff to school. But I want to give listeners hope that kids actually really thrive in the classroom and do well in school because they thrive on the consistency, they thrive on the structure, and they need it most when there's a disruption in the family, like divorce. And so I do think this is an important topic, and I'm grateful for the feedback that I've been given and for the requests. But before I read your bio, I just want to give a very genuine and sincere namaste to you and thank you, because you are a good person. And every time I see you or one of your staff, I always say, you're still fighting the good fight, because it is a fight out there. And you are what I would describe as a very good advocate for children and families. So thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. You know that for me, you're not just a client, you're a friend, and we consider you part of our family. And you've been through a lot, and it's our pleasure to be able to help you. And more importantly, be a supporting person, not just professionally, but personally. You're doing some really amazing things for your family, for the community, and through this podcast. So thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you. And you are a friend. I really appreciate that. And I did feel that. I felt like you really cared. And again, I had a couple attorneys before who were good people, very busy, but I didn't feel that real connection of like, I get this. This is your life and this is your kids' lives. And we really want to be helpful. And so it matters. And I know there's some tough stuff out there. So thank you. Justin, you joined Cragun Law Firm in 2013 with a practice focused on domestic litigation, trial advocacy, and high conflict divorce. In 2021, you helped expand Cragun Berube, is that right, by joining with another partner, and now it's Farr, Cragun, and Berube. In addition to family law, you have extensive experience in representing businesses, both large and small. You have spent hundreds of hours in court advocating for your clients and have successfully secured numerous favorable rulings in trial when mediation and settlement efforts proved unworkable. You have been recognized as one of the top lawyers in Utah. And as I was reading some of your accolades and your other awards, this one caught my eye: top 40 under 40 in Utah. And then in 2016, the National Academy of Family Law Attorneys recognized you as one of the top 10 under 40. Why do they need the under 40? I'm so curious. Are you still under 40?
Well, I crossed that bridge this year. I turned 40 this year. And so I guess
Okay, well,
our awards under 40, maybe they'll be top 10 over 40 now, hopefully. I guess we'll see.
yeah, now you'll be in the top 10 under 50 for a while.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, they're going to have to expand the parameters there. I like that you, and I saw this in your bio, and I do feel this from you, that you pride yourself on making sure your clients' voices are heard. And that's a big deal. So I guess my advice after doing 7 years of domestic court is I would say, interview and consult with attorneys. Would you tell people the same thing? Like, go and find the right fit for you.
100%. I mean, the best results always come when the attorney and the client see each other as a team. And so when you're trying to decide what family law lawyer is best for you, obviously get as much information as you can from friends, family members, but yes, interview as many people as you can. You're going to find the different personalities, different ways that lawyers communicate with you, and frankly, how lawyers are going to approach your case is going to vary substantially. And so if you really want the best outcome, you make sure you find someone who reflects your morals, reflects your values, is willing to stand up for you, and can be that voice for you. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be that person telling your story. And so you want to do everything you can to make sure you've got confidence in whoever you choose, that they really understand you, they connect with you, and are willing to go do the hard work to make sure that the end result is what you expect.
Thank you. That's good advice. I want to, before I ask you specific questions, I want you to respond to this, and I can actually edit this out if you're not okay with it. But again, my experience is limited, even though 7 years is a long time. But after I started going, I really took to heart this book. I know many people know this book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Anyway, there's a line in there, and the whole theme really is about putting purpose, taking your pain and turning it into a purpose. And so I really feel that, and I would recommend that to other people. Find something you're passionate about and go for it when you're in hard times. But my experience, so well, let me jump back. I started attending hearings for other people, and because I wish that I, in the early stages of this, I was just so naive. I didn't understand the vocabulary that's used in domestic court. There was a lot that I just didn't know, because you can't get that by just getting a traffic ticket and going and fighting it. So
Right?
I was very naive, and I wish I'd had someone kind of cheerlead me through those beginning stages that can be very upsetting, and you're already upset anyway. So it's a hard time. But as I was started attending for other people in domestic situations and getting to know, I know it happens to men too, but I only work with women. But this is my description of domestic court, and I just want kind of your honest, like, knee-jerk reaction to this. Are you ready?
Ready.
Okay. But I feel like domestic court, and I don't know what it was like 10 or 20 years ago, but I feel like it is this running treadmill of money making at the expense of the children.
My knee-jerk reaction to that is you could be right. And what I mean by that is it's really your approach to the case. I think there's a lot of times where my experience in court is there's a lot of punting, as I call it. Maybe judges, commissioners aren't necessarily willing to make the difficult rulings that are going to actually help move the case forward. I also think there's a real honest disconnect between our domestic courts, judges, commissioners who have to make a decision versus what's actually happening in people's homes. So oftentimes there's this expectation that parties who are divorcing or have been divorced for some time and haven't been able to make it work can just automatically start working together. They can communicate together. And that's not the reality for a lot of people, even if they're civil with one another. It's not just the high conflict divorces. I tell people all the time, look, there's a reason why people got divorced. It's probably because they're not communicating. It's probably because they're not on the same page as their spouses. And I think sometimes when you go into court, it doesn't feel very satisfying because you've got 15, 20 minutes to try to tell a story that has a lot of history. And so what can happen is oftentimes lawyers may intentionally or unintentionally choose a path that's not going to actually get you to the end result that's going to make a difference for the client or for the kids. And
Mhm.
so it can very much feel that way of why am I going to court? Why am I spending all of this money when maybe the kids are left in the same situation or there's not the end result? I think the only way to mitigate that is to be really serious about what areas of the law, what tools in the law are available to you, to your kids. They're going to actually get you in a place where things can be better. And maybe as importantly, how do you present that information in a way that matters and is going to resonate with decision makers? But the reality is domestic court can be a huge drain financially, emotionally, not only on the litigant, but on the kids. And so I understand where you're coming from. And I felt that way before as well.
Yeah. No, thank you. I really appreciate your take on that, and it's nice to know that you see it too. You just see it for what it is, and some of the tough things about it. That kind of leads me into my first question. In your opinion, as a trial, well, not all domestic attorneys do trial. Is that right?
I think that's right. I think it's
Okay.
kind of surprising for people to hear. You hear the word attorney, you just presume that attorney is good with courtroom work and trial, which is much different than being willing to go and argue at a hearing. We can go through
Yes.
different hearings in a family law case, but yeah, my view on it is there's a lot of attorneys who just simply are not willing to go to trial. They don't have the skill set. And as a result, that can end up where an attorney is pressuring a client to enter an agreement that may not be best for them, may not be best for their kids, because they're not willing to take it to that final step. Or unfortunately, because they don't have any intent to go to trial, they haven't taken the steps they needed to during the case to be prepared and follow the rules when they get to trial to get the outcome. So you're right. And that's why your advice at the start of should you interview attorneys is really, really important to
Yes.
understand what their background is. Do they just want to mediate your case and be done? Are they just willing to do hearings? Are they really willing to go all the way to trial if necessary?
Yeah. And you need to have those questions answered from the get-go. And so for someone like me, who I had no idea I even needed an attorney, you're just kind of thrown into, well, who knows somebody, but don't do that. Don't do that. Go and ask the questions and talk to people, get references, and figure it out. So as a domestic trial attorney, is domestic court being overused in your opinion? And when do parents going through divorce, because we all know, I mean, it's a no-brainer, this does affect the kids. And even though if kids don't know details, young children, older children, they're so smart these days, and they do know that they do know when parents are in court. They do know when things are happening. And so is it overused? And how can people really know if they need it?
Well, that is a lot of questions filled with a lot of landmines. I love the question. Well, let me just start with this. I think there's a difference between domestic litigation and the different type of resolutions that are available to clients early on. Now, there's a lot of studies out there that talk about kids and how divorce impacts kids. And so you'll hear people kind of cavalierly kind of throwing them around of, well, divorced kids are 3 times more likely to drop out of high school. Divorced kids are, 4 times more likely to, engage in underage drinking. Those stats aren't completely accurate. I think you have to put them in context. And the truth is that the elevated risk to kids is based on the parents' conduct during the litigation. Okay. And so what that really means is it's when parents are exposing them to the conflict, when parents are kind of creating what we call loyalty conflicts in their kids, where they feel like they have to choose one parent over the other, when parents are pressing children to choose them, trying to, undercut their relationship with other parents. It's that situation that's actually causing the escalated risk factors for divorcing families. The research is pretty clear that when parents are civil to one another, when parents are able to cooperate and work together with one another and do the best they can to shield their kids from some of the drama and conflict from the divorce, their risk factors aren't really that elevated. So when you ask the question, is domestic court overused or underused? It's a really, really hard question, because I think that if parties can work together and find a way to shield conflict and find ways to make sure their kids are protected, then they shouldn't run down the domestic court road. They
Mhm.
really should work together to try to get a resolution.
And mediate.
Yeah, mediate, try to come up with an agreement, using attorneys or not using attorneys. But the real problem for me is when we have parents who, one or both, who are not able or willing or don't understand how their actions are impacting kids. At
Mhm.
that point, my view is you have to be willing to engage in the domestic litigation system. And in that respect, it's kind of underutilized, because I think one of the worst things you can do is know that there's a problem and then reach a resolution through mediation or settlement that doesn't actually solve the problem.
Yeah.
Because then all you've done is delay that problem, leave the children in a situation that's going to result in them being continually exposed to the conflict, which is going to elevate those risk factors. And so being really honest with yourself about what your situation is, being really honest about your soon-to-be ex-spouse and what they're going to do is really, really important as you make that decision to engage the domestic courts. Because while I do this for a living and I consider myself a domestic trial litigator and I feel like I'm good in trial, the reality is that can create a lot of conflict for parents moving forward. However, that conflict can be valuable, and I mean valuable within the context of if you can get a ruling that actually protects the kids and gets systems in place and protections in place, then that needs to happen. So it's underutilized, in my opinion, in that realm. People don't take cases to trial enough. They just end up settling for a variety of reasons for something they know that's not going to work.
Yeah.
The result of that, Melanie, is they end up in 6, 7, 8, 9 years of domestic litigation and nothing ever gets solved. That's about the worst case you can leave yourself in. And you experience that.
Do you think I mean, you hit it on the head when you said it's also the parents' conduct during this time. So whether you are in court for a year or 8 years, it's your conduct. Do you see this because the families that I've worked with or have gotten to know in this way, which has actually been a blessing in my life, because I've learned from some really amazing people that just keep their heads up, they keep their hands clean, so to speak, and they just keep going. Do you feel like this is just what I think, but if one parent can be the anchor or is really, really trying, and it's hard because you're under a lot of stress. You have to fill out a lot of paperwork and it's emotional. Do you feel like those are the kid when you say, kids can be more at risk, I feel like kids still do pretty dang good at school, in the classroom, at home. They're still really high functioning if one parent can kind of be the hero. And I know you work with a lot of people. Do you see that?
I do see that. And I think really what you're talking about is you have one parent who's really dedicated to allowing their children to heal from the divorce, when they're really dedicated to just being a consistent, loving force in that kid's life. That definitely can kind of serve as a buffer. And I think any parent who's willing to do that, I take my hat off to them because, like you noted, they're dealing with the death of a relationship in the form of a divorce. They
Mhm.
have their own insecurities, their own emotional issues they're dealing with as they go through a divorce. And that ability to kind of separate your kids out and say, I'm going to do everything I can to protect those. I think kids see that. I think kids are inspired by that. Like you've said a couple of times, I think kids are really, really smart. And so having an anchor parent who can really, really focus on those kids and notice when they are struggling, get them the help they need, whether that's
Yes.
just a hug from mom or dad, whether that's giving them, maybe not being as strict on some of the family rules because they
Mhm.
recognize there's
Letting
problems,
some things go for sure.
letting
Yeah,
some things go. Maybe it's getting them into counseling so that they have
absolutely.
professional help to
Yep.
help them deal with maybe another parent who's not acting appropriately. But really, just the biggest thing is making sure that kid knows they're still loved, by both parents, even if one's not necessarily acting appropriately. But really, that's in that parent's control, right? They can control what parent time looks like in their home. They
Mhm.
can control how that child feels when they're with them. And I think that can make a huge difference to any child.
What do you thank you. Thank you. What do you think about I saw this one time and it was pretty extreme, but if you feel like there is a parent using the court system to harass the other parent, that is going to affect your kids. What do you do? Well, I guess first of all, if you have a client like that, what do you do? And then if it's not your client, what do you say to that? And do you see it?
Well, first of all, if it's my client, I don't tolerate that type of behavior with my
Good.
clients. The reality is that we are very blessed to be busy. We deeply appreciate all of our clients, but at the end of the day, I still have to sleep at night and I still want to do the right thing. So if it's my client, I will basically say, this is what the law provides. I'm happy to advocate for you. But if we're crossing the line into harassment, it's something I just simply won't be involved in. And I'll ask that person politely to maybe seek another attorney who's willing to engage in that type. Um,
I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you. Because with this situation, I just thought this was a kind of a form of abuse. And I remember she asked her attorney how long could this go on? And do you know what he said? He said, you'd be surprised.
yeah. Unfortunately, it doesn't surprise me to hear that story. And I have experienced it where I've defended against that type of conduct. And for me, there's really two keys on that. Like, number one, you can only control your emotional reaction to what somebody's doing to you. And what I mean by that is we do have what we call an open court system. And it's really frustrating because an
Mhm.
open court system means that we have a court system that anybody has access to at any time and can have their grievance heard at any time. Now, that's a huge blessing if you've been aggrieved, but that can also be used as kind of a sword rather than the shield it's intended to be when someone just wants to use the court system to bludgeon you over and over and over again. So the first piece of advice I have for anyone is, look, if you have someone who is using the court system, as a way of abusing you. You have to stop and recognize, why is that person doing that? The most likely reason is they want the reaction out of you. They want to continue, whether you're in a domestic violence relationship, an emotionally abusive relationship, or just an abusive relationship in general. Abusers usually don't let their victims go. And so they can use the court system as that tool to keep them in the abuse cycle. So one of the things you can do is control your reaction to that. If you're the person who's being picked on, not giving that person what they desire, which is the ability to continue to mess with you, the ability to continue to negatively impact you, can be the first step for you having some peace. It doesn't solve everything, but it also starts to kind of create a deterrent. That party's not getting what they want out of it anymore, which is the negative reaction from you.
Hmm.
And number two, and this may sound a little counterintuitive, that's where you need to be willing to litigate. When someone's bringing false claims against you, when someone's using it to harass you, their hope is that you'll just roll over. Their
Mhm.
hope is that you'll be intimidated by the system, that you won't want to go anymore. And I think setting a boundary with that person of saying, look, I'm not going to roll over because you came around the corner and said boo, right? I'm not going to be intimidated because you filed a petition with the court. That's where you need to stand your ground and create the boundary. Because if you don't have good boundaries, especially if you've been in a domestic violence relationship, you'll continue to be victimized over and over and over again. So being willing to say, I'm not tolerating this behavior, and then having a lawyer who's willing to call a spade and gather the information and create the evidence that you're going to need to be successful is going to send the message to that party that you're not intimidated. And they may try to use the court system, but at some point, the judge or commissioner on your case is going to see the case for what it is. So telling that story, creating the idea that this person is using the system to be abusive, and being willing to hold your ground, I think are really the key.
I'm glad you said that, because by not having a boundary, like with some personalities, if someone is abusing the court or trying to harass another parent in this way, the only boundary that person might listen to is a legal boundary. And by not setting it and not seeking litigation and having this happen, that's putting your kids through a lot more by being back kind of in the cycle, so to speak. Like, it just needs to be able to stop, right?
I agree with you. And I think the analogy I would make on that is, a pattern I see play out a lot in my personal life, my, neighborhood community. I'll have a lot of people approach, because I'm a divorce lawyer, and say, I feel like I need to stay for the kids. And I hear that a lot. And it's a really hard situation, because I understand where someone's coming from. But the analogy is this: if your kids are living in a toxic environment, and they're seeing abuse, they're seeing emotional abuse, they're just seeing a person, maybe it's not abuse, it's just maltreated, unhealthy relationships. That's what's being modeled for them. And those kids feel it. They
Yeah.
know they're not in a healthy place, right? And so by saying, well, I don't necessarily want to engage because I think it's better for them to be in a toxic environment. If you say it that way, it kind of sounds silly. Now, I'm not an advocate of divorce. I think if parties can work it through, that's what's ultimately best for the kids. But being honest and realistic about what your kids are really seeing inside a divorce setting or inside an intact family is the same analogy here, right? Like, if you don't ultimately say, look, I'm just going to stand up, I'm not going to allow the toxicity, then I think you're just going to get the same result, which is the kids suffer, the parents suffer, you stay in a cycle of maltreatment, and that's not healthy for anybody. It's
Yeah.
actually your worst outcome.
Yeah, I think there are people that do need to hear that. And I'm going to reinforce that by giving just a Dr. Philism, which he says kids would rather be from a broken home than live in one.
Mhm.
And I think that's true. I think that's what you're saying. And I listen, I'm pro marriage. I've been remarried for 5 years. Beautiful, lovely. It's God's gift to me. And so there is hope and love and light after you go through these really rough circumstances. And so I want to say that, but thank you. Boundaries are huge. And can you back to when you were saying, the commissioners and the judges, they're seeing this, and it can take a long time for them to get it. Tell me that they really can come through and set that boundary? Like, do you see it happen that they, because there are times where you think, oh, they're not. I mean, I've sat in several, I'm like, they're not getting it. And because they can't possibly know what a person's life really is like, and maybe who's lying and who isn't. But do you see the, judges and commissioners come down hard on sometimes when it's necessary?
I do. Now, it takes some time and some patience, and oftentimes people end up waving the white flag before they get there. I
Mm,
do think in general we have some really good judges and really, really good commissioners who want to do the right thing, but you hit it, right? You're given 25 pages, per motion total, and you're oftentimes only given 30 minutes, sometimes 45 minutes to go and give your story to someone who hasn't lived and breathed what you have. And so they're kind of looking at a snapshot and they're trying to do the very best that they can. And so oftentimes, I think while they want to do the right thing, sometimes it's really difficult for them to sort through who the aggressor is, who's being honest, what's really happening. And so I do see them doing the right thing. I do see them ultimately coming down on people, getting to the right ruling, but it's usually not the first time. It's usually
mhm.
not the first hearing, the first order to show cause, the first time. It's really having the strategy of constantly building your case, constantly building your narrative, and as importantly, making sure you have the evidence to support it. I think commissioners and judges get put in a really, really hard place when mom comes in and says A's happening, dad comes in and says B is happening, and those stories are diametrically opposed. They
Yeah.
don't know you, they haven't lived it like you have. And so oftentimes they just end up throwing their hands up in the air and saying, well, I don't know who's being honest here, but both of you knock it off. That's a common complaint I get from a lot of people. And my rejoinder to that is you have to build the case step by step by step, and taking every opportunity to tell your story to the judge, provide that judge evidence, text messages, social media posts, getting other professionals involved, counselors, therapists, guardian ad litems. I know we'll maybe talk about that a little later, and really making sure you can kind of cut through the gray area
Mhm.
and really help the court see clearly what's happening. The
What's
goal
really
should
happening?
be, yeah, the goal should be to get the commissioner or judge to interpret the facts through your eyes. And the only way to do that is give them the information and tell the story in a powerful way. But it does take a minute. It is expensive and it can be frustrating.
Yes. Yes, yes, and yes. Attorneys always say, don't tell your kids anything. But as we already talked about, kids are smart and they are pretty strategic. They're very much paying attention. I like that you mentioned they're also paying attention to a parent's example of ignoring some behavior, or I don't know. I got really great advice from a therapist early on that said, she said, if your kids ask you something specific, even young kids, you tell them the truth, but don't go beyond that. Don't keep going. Don't give them more than what they asked. Because if their brain is formulating a question, then it needs to be answered truthfully. But if they get too much, that can be overwhelming for a child, and then they can't emotionally regulate. But when attorneys say, don't tell your kids anything, and that your kids and families I've worked with, that they do know what's kind of going on a little bit. Just explain what's behind that with attorneys and what they're really trying to protect the kids from.
Yeah. Well, I just think sometimes there's a little bit of fear when attorneys give that advice out because I
Mm,
do think the judges, the commissioners, therapists, guardian ad litems, everyone involved in case big goal is to shield the kids from conflict.
mhm,
And it's not just shielding them from conflict, but they're also want to be very careful that one parent isn't sharing negative information about the other parent and kind of influencing that child to either have a lesser relationship or to have negative feelings. And a lot of that is generated from the idea that you're divorcing somebody. So you don't always have positive feelings for the person you're divorcing. And so those negative feelings can spill over into how you communicate with kids. So when attorneys are saying, don't talk to your kids about it, I think they're maybe inappropriately trying to draw a really bright line with the best of intent, which
mm,
is to make sure their clients aren't violating court orders, making sure that parents aren't exposing their kids to conflict, making sure that one parent's not intentionally or sometimes unintentionally shading, their child's view of the other parent. So that's where it comes from. My view on it, probably aligns a little more closely to the advice the therapist got. I think you can talk to kids about the situations and realities they're in without doing it in a negative way, without saying negative things about the other parent, without shading. I think the truth is that there's an unrealistic expectation with judges and commissioners. If you go to a hearing, you'll hear a judge or commissioner say, if your kid asks you about this, you just tell them that mom and dad are taking care of that and you both love them very much. Well, Melanie, in theory, that sounds good. And in practice, it rarely works out that way. You say that to a 16-year-old, they're going to look at you like you're from outer space. Like,
Yeah.
come on, mom, right?
Yeah.
You know that there's more going on, and they may not accept that. And then it creates a situation where they get more aggressive. They ask you more and more and more and more, and they may start to not trust you as the parent because they don't feel like you're being forthright with them. So I think there's two ways. I think the safest way to handle it is, if you do have a therapist involved, try to address the issue or concern with the therapist, right? With the child, you, and the therapist. That's the safest way to do it. It's not always going to be feasible for everybody, but that allows you the professional guidance of a therapist who understands how to communicate in a way that's not going to be harmful. If that option's not available to you, I think you have to take great care to not inadvertently cause conflict with your child. I think you can be honest with them about the situation. I think not getting into a lot of detail about why there's a divorce or what you think the other parent's done wrong is important, and I think that should be avoided. But you still get to be a mom during the pendency of a divorce. You
Mhm.
still get to have conversations with your kids. You still get to guide them through the process. And so a lot of parents are like, I feel like I can't be a parent. And I don't think that's true. I think you should be
Yeah.
able to have honest conversations that are not throwing anyone under the bus. You don't want to lose credibility with your kid at a time where they're looking for stability. They're looking for consistency. They're looking for answers. And to leave them in the dark, I think, can cause them more anxiety than just sitting down and helping them understand. Again, not saying negative things about the other parent,
Yeah.
not saying your dad did this or your dad
Right.
did this or your
Right.
dad's the problem, but just really being a guiding post through them as they navigate it too. Because let's be honest, those kids are struggling just like you are when you're going through a divorce. And to shut them out and say, we don't get to talk about it, I think that can create kind of a toxic relationship between you and your kid.
Thank you. I want to second all that you're saying. Just and uh, I can say that family therapy is so helpful. And again, it's kind of like finding the right fit for your attorney, but you need a right fit for family therapy or individual therapy. But there are times where, if a therapist is working with your child, then they can help guide you as a parent, because there are times that you really don't know how to handle a specific situation or conversation, especially where you want to be really age appropriate with a child and not cause the anxiety that you're talking about, cause more anxiety. And so thank you. I'm a big fan of therapy, family therapy, and finding the right one is a big deal.
Well, I
What
always think about it like this, Melanie. Sorry to cut you off there.
No, you're
Is
great.
I know you're an awesome school teacher, but here's the truth. If I walked in and I tried to manage your classroom for a day, those kids would eat me alive,
They eat
right?
live too.
But the lesson there is, we're all an expert in our field, right? Just like you're an expert in teaching. Hopefully, I'm perceived as an expert in the law. And so rely on those people who have the expertise that you don't. And there's no shame as a parent of coming in and saying, I've never been in a divorcing situation before. I've
Mhm.
never had to deal with these type of questions from my kids. I've never had to deal with these emotions from me, these emotions from my kids. Bring people in, surround yourself with people who have those expertise and be willing to learn from them and
Yes.
modify your own behavior and modify your feelings and kind of let them help you guide not only you, but your kids through the divorce process.
Yes, thank you. Because it's okay to just say, you know what, these are there are some tools here that I just simply don't have, or help me to help my child, or help me to help me. It takes a lot of stripping yourself of pride, I think, to say, you know what, I don't know how to manage this. And but I agree with you that we have really great professionals that have seen this and led people through this a million times, and our families definitely benefited, and I've seen other families really benefit from this. So yes, go and take the time to have your kids or you meet with a counselor and get those resources in place. It's super valuable, and it's actually really empowering for those kids because they're being shaped
Mm.
by their experiences just like we're being shaped through it.
Yeah, and not only that, those counselors are also giving your kids tools to deal with their own emotion, maybe giving that child tools on how to communicate with parents better, tools on how to cope with their own grief, their own conflict that sometimes as parents we just can't give them. And so having that ability just to take a step back and say, you know what, it is okay to bring in a counselor. It is okay. It shouldn't be stigmatized, and
Yes,
I think we're getting past that.
I do
I think
too.
10 years ago, counseling therapy, was a little taboo, but yeah, don't be afraid to get those moms. Don't be afraid to get those counselors involved. And you're an awesome mom. You don't have to solve your own problems and all your kids' problems. Get the support you need.
Yes, it's huge. It's honestly life changing just to get some direction, and it is a really challenging time because you're feeling all the emotions of it, and then if you're trying to be strong for your child and they're falling apart, you do need to bring in some help. And so I found that it's a very beautiful experience. I've learned so much from really great people that have this wisdom and know how to guide you through some really tricky situations. And so I'm an advocate of that. Thank you for sharing that as an attorney. Can you talk about any other mistakes that you see parents making that just can't avoid a court process? I'm just curious, in the years you've been practicing, do you think contentious behavior has become worse, or was it that way before we're just more aware?
I mean, this is going to be an imperfect science, but I'm going to have to, I think, agree that I think the level of contention in divorces is rising.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's just an overall societal thing. I think we can all agree we're seeing more conflict, more contention, more behavior that we didn't see 10, 15 years ago. So I think it's getting worse, not better. What are the mistakes that are being made? I think one that I see a lot is if you have two good parents, sometimes you're so angry at the other parent, you can't separate your anger, hatred, or what that your spouse did to you as a spouse versus them being a good parent. And so sometimes having that ability to kind of take a step back and take a deep breath and say, are these my feelings? And I'm trying to project them on the kids, or is there really a problem here?
Hmm.
Practical mistakes in litigation. I think people, they don't document things. They don't ultimately create the information or evidence they need to tell their story when they've got a bad actor on the other side. There's a million different things that will happen. The best way to do it is you just keep a journal of what
Hmm.
happened. There's no way, especially when you're in a high conflict litigation situation, that you're going to remember all the things that have happened. So people won't keep journals. I think sometimes too, they don't know how to communicate properly with the other side. For lack of a better word, they'll get baited. They'll get triggered by the other side, and the other side really like let's be honest, who knows how to trigger you better than your spouse? You're married to him for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Oftentimes those people we loved and let in and cared about the most know what our weaknesses are. And a lot of times when you have an aggressive person on the other side, they'll use that information to send you information, text messages, emails, make comments to you in public at kids' extracurricular activities. The whole purpose of getting you triggered and getting a reaction out of you so they can turn around and say, look how outrageous she was. Look what she did. Look at her emails to me. Look at her text messages. So I think the number one mistake I see is that people communicate when they're in that emotional state.
Hmm.
And then all of a sudden, what they've inadvertently done is they've created bad evidence that allows the other side to go in and say,
Use it.
Yeah, look how outrageous she is. I can't communicate with her, when the reality is that was all kind of done intentionally to get a rise out of you. And
A
so,
setup, a setup.
yeah,
Putting that in
yeah.
there.
And look, what I always tell people, and I firmly believe this, is we can't control our knee-jerk reactions. The reason we call these knee-jerk reactions is because we're oftentimes not in control of the emotion that flows in when we get triggered. And so as an attorney, I tell people it's okay to have that emotional response. It's okay to be angry, upset. It's okay to cry. Have that reaction, but don't communicate with that person when you're in that state of emotion.
Right, because that's when you make the serious mistakes,
That's
and
when
then
it
it
kind
will
of
show up in court. Yes, it will.
always, always will show up in
But
court.
that's part of the setup, yeah, that I've seen with, families I've worked with is
Yeah. And so
all
the
for the
key,
setup, and you're an emotional, and it is emotional, and
okay,
that's something that you can take. And two, I think not don't feel like you have to respond so quickly.
wonderful advice. I
That
agree with you.
is being a yeah.
Yeah, because I think it's kind of a three-step process. Like number one, the first step is just recognizing you are in an emotional state. That's
Mhm.
the first step. And if
Yeah,
you can train yourself to just recognize, look, I'm upset right now, I'm angry right now, the blood is boiling or it's bubbling up, that's the first step. And the second step is letting yourself have the reaction you need to have so you can cope with it. You have a right to have your feelings, right? And then the third step is not responding until that has cleared. And I
yeah,
agree with you wholeheartedly. You know, your ex-spouse, or if you're in a divorce with someone, they're not entitled to a communication within 10 minutes, right? I think generally speaking, 24 hours is an acceptable time frame to respond to a communication from your ex-husband. And so don't let them pressure you or bully you into feeling like you have to communicate when you're not ready. Because you're right, it gets used against you every single time.
every single time, and then the judge can't really make, an accurate assessment because they don't know the history behind the setup.
It blurs the line on who the aggressor is.
Yes,
All
yeah,
they see is you going off on them on a text message or, in an email, and they very rarely understand, like you said, the history and why something they said was so harmful to you. They very rarely can actually understand the level of abuse you've suffered through the marriage, right? And because of that, they're just going to look at the information in front of them that's inaccurate, and then that's where judges and commissioners get stuck.
now, I have some specific questions regarding child custody evaluations, and that was actually a couple of comments that came through my email, because that is when it does and sometimes does involve a classroom teacher, and I've had to do that as well, especially in the last 5 years. 20 years ago when I was in the classroom, I never was involved in a divorce situation for one of my students. But as teachers, we are asked sometimes to be part of a child custody evaluation. Will you talk a little bit about that process? Because it's scary. It's scary for the kids. It's scary for the parent that didn't request it. And maybe it's scary for the parent that did. I don't know. What do you say about this process?
Yeah, it can be an intimidating process. So, just for your listeners' benefit, here in Utah, we have the Rules of Judicial Administration, and it's Rule 4903 that permits the court to essentially engage an expert in child and family studies, child psychology, social work, etc. But this expert is really tasked with providing recommendations to the court about custody and parent time and what's in children's best interest. So we generally refer to that as a custody evaluator. And so
By
custody
the
evaluator,
way, do other states not do this, or does it just depend?
not every state does it. In
Okay,
fact, there's actually been a trend lately of people eliminating custody evaluations versus running two custody evaluations in other states. It's still very much a thing here in Utah. But
okay.
no, not every state does it. And just for clarity, a custody evaluator is not required on every case. In fact, Rule 4903 says one can only be appointed if one party asks for one or the court finds that there's extraordinary circumstances and a court orders it. And so that's usually something you definitely want to address with your attorney, whether or not a custody evaluator would be something you want to do in your case, go through the benefits. But look, I think it can be scary for people because they're now interacting with an expert and they're worried about, how do I present concerns? How do I present my side of the story? It can always feel intimidating when someone's coming and assessing you as a parent. I mean, how terrifying, right? You're going to have someone you don't know who's allegedly an expert is going to come in and say, Melanie, you fell short here on parenting, and you feel like they're going to be scrutinizing you. So it can feel intimidating. Basically, what the custody evaluation process looks like is that a custody evaluator is going to meet with each party. They're usually going to have you fill out some type of questionnaire that's going to give them some background and some history. They're going to meet with each party at least once, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times in their office. Then that custody evaluator is going to make a home visit to each parent's home, where they're going to kind of see how the parents are interacting. They're trying to assess the relationships, the bonds that the kids have. The custody evaluator is going to ask each parent to provide what we call collateral contacts. Oftentimes that can be teachers. I think if you express being involved, it can be other family members. It can be therapists who are involved. And they're trying to gather kind of enough information to really try to make a recommendation to the court what's in the kid's best interest. There'll be some basic psychological testing that occurs during the custody evaluations. And so the custody evaluator is also going to talk to the kids. They'll usually have parents bring the kids to their office. Each parent will bring them in during their parent time. They'll meet with the kids. They'll kind of try to understand what the kids are feeling. They usually don't directly ask the kids what their preferences are. They'll kind of do it in a roundabout way to see if they can understand what's working for the kids and what's not. And once they've kind of done that whole process, they're then going to schedule what's called a 4903 settlement conference. And that's where you come together with the custody evaluator, you come together with your attorneys and a mediator, and the custody evaluator will basically say, these are my recommendations and why. And here's kind of parent time. Here's some parenting plan issues that I think are in the kid's best interest. So that's kind of a really broad overview of the process. I know that's a lot, so hopefully I gave enough detail, but not too much.
No, thank you. And again, I could edit this out if needed, but I do have some strong feelings about this after seeing this with other families and experiencing it ourselves. I would be a fan of it being eliminated here in Utah. And I'm just asking the question, is it really possible for any kind of evaluator to really see or get a sense of what goes on in a home just by being in your home for 30 minutes 2 times in 6 months or something like that? Do you know
I
what I mean? I
do.
it's I don't know if there can really be a true assessment. The other problem that I'm observing is you only have a certain amount of evaluators, and they're all being recommended by several different courts and ranging in the area, and these evaluators are overwhelmed. And so if you are a parent in it, you feel like this is our lives, like this is a big deal. But for the evaluator, it's just like paperwork is how it feels. I'm just wondering, what do you think about that? And have you ever seen it work? I mean, if there's a case that involves, there's sexual abuse or physical abuse or chemical abuse happening by a parent, have you seen, could there be more, do you think, parameters that could happen where a custody evaluation really is essential, as opposed to this is, neither parent is has a chemical dependence, there's not physical abuse happening in the home. I don't know. What's your opinion?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question because I think we do have some really, really good evaluators out there who want to do the right thing, who really, really do care about the kids that they're dealing with, who care about the parties. And I do think their hearts are in the right place.
Yeah.
I do kind of agree with your assessment that it is really difficult for anyone, like, let's say you've been in a 20-year marriage. I mean, it is really difficult for anybody, custody evaluator, guardian ad litem, judge, anybody, to really get a true sense of what you've gone through with such minimal interactions. And so my view on custody evaluators is they're not right for every case.
Mhm.
I think you need to really be honest about what are the circumstances in your case. How will it impact your kids? how are your kids going to address it? Because look, when you have younger kids in a custody evaluation situation, that can be a difficult situation. I mean, the expectation that let's say a 7-year-old is going to open up to some stranger who they've
Right.
never met in
In a
some
20-minute
office.
interview at school where they're pulled out and they don't know why they're being pulled out,
Right.
that's upsetting to a child.
It
Yeah.
can be. Now,
Yeah.
I think our evaluators do a great job of really minimizing the impact that it has on kids. But,
Mhm.
my point is that, how good is the data and information that's being collected? Because, younger kids, it can be really intimidating to talk to another professional. I have a 7-year-old myself, and when it's just me and her, man, she'll talk the whole way home. Obviously when they're trying to go to bed, that's when you get all the details about life and everything to avoid bedtime, right? But she'll talk your ear off. But if you throw another person, even who she knows, another adult in the room, she gets really shy. And how many of our kids are like that? And so what is the data? Is it really accurate? Is it really, is that evaluator really getting what the kids need? Now, when you have older kids, teenage kids, or maybe preteens, this is a difficult situation for kids because they may be telling one parent what they want to hear because they don't want the conflict. Or oftentimes, kids don't want to feel responsible for the outcome of a custody evaluation. So, you take a 15-year-old kid and they go tell the evaluator something, and now all of a sudden the evaluator says, well, mom's getting less parent time. That 15-year-old might draw the connection that it was me as a 15-year-old who said something, and now I don't get to see my mom. That's a lot for a child to bear.
Sure.
Now, again, I want to be really clear. We have wonderful evaluators
Yes.
in general. I have some that I trust more than others, but we have wonderful evaluators who will do everything in their power to minimize that, reaction or negative consequence for your kids. But I don't think evaluators are right for every single case.
Have you seen it work?
Ooh, put me on the spot. I will be really honest, because I do want to be transparent with you.
Yeah.
There are times where I don't feel like the process has worked.
Thank
There's
you.
been times where I feel like the reality of the situation, um, and my view of the case and the evidence that I'm seeing doesn't necessarily line up with recommendations. And so it just, in full transparency, yeah, there are times where I don't feel like the process works. And I feel like the process is intentionally abused by some parents. They
Mhm.
just want to get a professional in there who they know is, just going to come out with 50-50 custody and try to pressure the other parent by saying, well, we have this expert who met with everyone, met with the kids. This expert saying 50-50. Why are you being the bad parent who won't agree?
Mm.
And so I think that custody evaluators can be abused. Now, again, I don't think the custody evaluators are doing things on purpose. I think they're genuinely
Sure.
good people. I think they're qualified. I think they try their best. But you hit on an important thing. We only have a handful left in Utah for a variety of reasons we probably don't have time to get into today, but they're overwhelmed. They're busy. They're great people doing the best they can, but it doesn't always, in
Too
my view,
many.
the
Too
way it
many.
should. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your honesty in answering that. Um, that leads me to what maybe does work. And again, I've seen this just a couple of times, and I want to know what you think about it, because this really might be the key to helping your kids if you add a guardian ad litem. Will you explain what that is? When I talked to one with a different family and was part of that process, I just asked him, how many families are you working with? And he said 300. And I was overwhelmed by that for him. And so, again, it's kind of like what you said about custody evaluators, even well intentioned, very knowledgeable custody evaluators have so many that they're trying to get to that you can become a number. So, in this case, though, a guardian litem was speaking to the family therapist, and that seemed to be a really good situation because a guardian litem is an attorney for your kids. Am I explaining that right?
You are. Yeah, you're exactly right. There's
And
just,
courts listen to them? Do you feel like courts really listen to a guardian litem? Will you explain what your feelings about
yeah.
that?
So I think there's two things. We have what we call private guardian ad litems, and we have public guardian ad litems. Private guardian ad litems are the guardian ad litems that we see getting appointed in domestic cases. Public guardian ad litems are actually employed, and let me be clear, private guardian ad litems are private attorneys who are rostered with the Office of Guardian Ad Litem, meaning they've done specific training to be able to work with kids, but it's usually the parents who end up kind of paying the fees, the private fees for a private guardian ad litem. Public guardian ad litems are employed by the state of Utah. They're not generally available in divorce cases unless there is evidence of abuse or neglect, and there's ongoing involvement of DCFS, or the Division of Child and Family Services.
So does that mean the court assigns a public guardian ad litem in that case?
Yeah, so if there's a protective order, allegations of abuse or neglect, yes, the court will assign a public guardian ad litem for as long as DCFS is involved. If it turns out the allegations are unfounded, oftentimes the public guardian ad litems are released from the case. Private guardian ad litems are what you often see in divorce situations, modification situations. They are also appointed by the court, but in this situation, you're paying the private guardian ad litem to kind of to work on the case. So there's kind of those two tiers of guardian ad litems. But you explained it perfectly. The guardian ad litem is the attorney who's assigned to your children, and their purpose is to complete an investigation of whatever issues may be at hand, and then to ultimately make a report to the court about their investigation with the intent that they're going to be advocating for your children. And so that's kind of a big picture of guardian ad litems.
Thank you. So why can't we move towards having guardian ad litems that meet with family counselors and can do a better job of speaking? Because if you have your children involved in therapy, that's probably a pretty consistent thing, once a week, twice a week, whatever. And then the guardian ad litem is getting information from there that can actually be listened to in court. Why can't we go more that direction to help our kids and families instead of using a custody evaluation system that is super expensive and maybe just isn't as thorough? Is it because there are not as many guardian ad litems, or what's the issue?
I think we actually have more guardian ad litems than custody evaluators. I think the distinction is that your custody evaluator is going to have specific training, and they're going to have a set of expertise that a guardian ad litem's not. Guardian ad litems are trained attorneys. They all have a JD. So they don't necessarily, they may not or likely don't have the background in psychology and child family studies and child psychiatry. And so they're a little more limited in being, able to sit down with a child and say, well, I think parental alienation is occurring, or I think there's emotional abuse occurring. They don't necessarily have that skill set. And so I think the courts have to be careful that they don't put a guardian ad litem in the same role as a custody evaluator, and it force a guardian ad litem to make recommendations or engage in investigations or conduct that kind of goes outside their realm of training. Now, what you hit on, I think, is something really important, Melanie, is we have this really hard line we have to walk in family law cases. And that is, if we have therapists involved, we want the kids to feel like they can go to that therapist and be honest and develop a therapeutic relationship. At the same time, you may be getting evidence or information through the therapist about abuse, neglect, bad things that are happening at the other parent's house. And so how do we walk that line of making sure the court has that information from a therapist without ultimately getting to a place where the child doesn't feel comfortable going to the therapist because they know anything they say is going to make it to mom or dad and to the court? And so I think a guardian...
Isn't the goal to protect the child?
Yes, and that's where the conflict comes in. You're absolutely right. And so guardian ad litems can be extremely helpful in being able to gather that information from the therapist, gather that information from other individuals who are involved, and then make an assessment to the court about what's happening. So you're exactly right. That's, in my mind, is one of the greatest utilities of a guardian ad litem, is getting that information in front of the court. Look, therapy's not going well. Look, the child's disclosing things that may not be abuse, but are troublesome. Look, the child is kind of verifying what's happening, what mom's saying is happening. And so that they can be a way to protect kids in litigation by getting that information to the court, because it's pretty rare that a court is going to have that therapist come in and make a report directly to the judge. So
I
having that conduit through the guardian ad litem that allows that information to flow through the judge so the kid can be protected is extremely important.
That's really good information. I hope listeners that need this are really processing it. If you could wave like a magic wand and pick something that you think really could make this process better, meaning less emotional damage for the kids, and if there really was something feasible that could make this better for the kids, what do you, I know it's a big question, what do you think it would be?
My magic wand would be ensuring that those kids' voices are heard.
Yes.
The information that they're providing is conveyed accurately and without bias from either parent. I strongly believe that kids' voices are not heard enough in these domestic cases. The parents are yelling so loud and the court's so focused. This is not meant to be a critique of the court, but the judges, they have to deal with more than just parent time in a divorce case. There's division of assets, there's alimony, there's child support. You name it. There's a variety of topics that they're trying to do their best to help these parties
Yes.
with. So my magic wand would be that these judges could have the honest, true, and accurate information from these kids about honestly what they're seeing, honestly what's hard for them, and really what they think is going to be helpful them. It's not that we let kids run the show here, right? We should
Right.
never let kids run the show, especially when they're young. They're not mentally and emotionally mature enough to choose what type of relationship they should have with a parent. So I don't want to be misunderstood that if a kid says something, we should automatically do it. But shouldn't we really give honest, thoughtful, and sincere consideration to what the kids are going through, what
Yes.
their hardships are, what they think would be helpful to them, and incorporate that in? Because when we don't do it, these poor kids, they just get caught in the middle and they can feel helpless. Like, it doesn't matter if I tell the therapist, nothing happens. It doesn't matter if I tell the guardian ad litem, nothing happens. It doesn't matter if I report this to mom because the court's not going to do anything. And think about being in that situation as a kid. You don't have money to go hire your own lawyer. You don't have access to the system, right? And so at some point, these kids, I think, just get thrown kind of back and forth in the wave of conflict. So that'd be my magic wand.
I think that's excellent. And that is my magic wand matches that it's really about the kids and what can help them the most. Do you find that because judges are doing a lot of other types of cases, for example, when I went with a friend of a friend, and was just supporting her and sitting in the courtroom, that judge had just left a very serious case about rape, and it
Yeah.
was a criminal judgment he had to give. So then he's coming in off of the heels of that and listening to what probably would feel to him, I'm guessing, because I don't know, or to anyone, like, this seems really frivolous, of parents bantering, and the judgment just seemed a little bit short and not really thorough and kind of abrupt. But I could understand too that a judge is making some really, they're doing criminal cases as well. Do you see that?
I
And
do.
can it be separated somehow so that you're not seeing domestic cases on the same days as criminal, or is it just not like that? Because I don't.
Unfortunately, well, first of all, I see exactly what you're talking about, and you're right. And this, again, is not a knock on our judges. I think our judges genuinely want to do the best that they can. We
Yes.
have to remember, our judges are people just like we are.
Yeah.
You know, I have a bad day, my performance may not be as well. The judge is going to have bad days. The judge is going to have personal issues going on in his or her life. And you're right, the judge can be very overwhelmed by difficult murder cases, rape cases, child pornography cases. I mean, you think what these poor judges have to look at and endure and go through. And I can understand where you just handle something so heavily. And
Yeah.
now parents want to fight about something. You're like, come on, you guys. I just dealt with parents who lost their kid.
Yes. And now
And
the
I'm
judge just says, well, I don't care. 50-50. There you go. There you go. I mean, I don't know if it's, to that point, but is there something that can be done?
Unfortunately, the way our current system is set up, there really isn't any direct control, I think, that attorneys have to say, can we separate these things out on separate days? When we schedule these hearings, it's the court who's telling us what days they have available. And then you're coordinating that. And very rarely do we know what's on the calendar. The attorneys know what's on the calendar before. We've tried to separate it a little bit because here in Utah, we have the judge and the commissioner system. And so commissioners, they hear all domestic cases. They're not judges, but they look, act, and you wouldn't know the difference. They're qualified. So we tried to do that by saying commissioners only hear family law. Judges only hear family law cases when they make it to trial or when someone has objected to a commissioner's recommendation, which was probably what happened when you were there. So we've tried to create some separation, but there's just not a good solution to the problem you're raising. I'm going to be really honest with you.
Yeah. Well, maybe someone out there is going to do something about it.
Well, this is a great way
A
to start the
representative.
conversation. This is a
Yeah.
great way to start the conversation.
Well, when you said that contentious behavior is worse now, I think most of us, just by watching the news, we can agree with that just as a general statement, because we know our mental health has really struggled in our society. And I think COVID was kind of like when we all really noticed, like, oh, yeah, this is a problem. But maybe now there is a time for change where we can do some things differently so that it really is about the kids and protecting them and making this a better process for families that do have to go through it and are going through it. Your knowledge and your good-hearted self has given us so much today. This is one of my longer interviews, but so important. And because it was requested so many times, I just think this is where we're at now in society, and we do need to get this information out there. So we didn't even run through our divorce 101, and we were going to do all those vocabulary terms, but you can Google that, everybody. So
Well,
you
Melanie,
just
you're an absolute delight. You're a friend. I'd be happy to come
thank
back
you.
anytime for a follow-up if you'll have me.
I would love to do that. Will you just end with kind of offering some hope of when you see families get through it and it's okay and your kids are okay? Because my perspective now that we're about a year out on the other side of all that is kids become strong, parents become stronger. And I'm going to make this spiritual, like Heavenly Father, God above, He gives us so much opportunity to change and do better and learn. And if we can do that as the adults, then it really helps our kids see it and do it. So you offer us some hope that way?
Well, I will tell you, one of the reasons I absolutely love being a family law lawyer is when we'll have hard cases. And 3 years later, I'll run into a mom and maybe the daughter we helped. And they run up and give me a big hug and they say, here's my daughter. Do you remember her? She was 8 when we were going through this. She's doing wonderful. I'm doing wonderful. I'm happy. And what I will tell you is, and I genuinely mean that, it's the most beautiful thing because oftentimes when people walk into our office, they're in despair.
Yeah.
They're in one of the darkest times of their lives. They didn't expect a divorce. They don't want the divorce, or they're just coming to the place where they know they need the divorce. And I don't think it's any surprise that depression can set in, anxiety can set in. But here's the hope. If you work on yourself and you understand that it's just a minute in the hour,
Yeah.
and the goal of divorce is not just to get somebody divorced, not just to get them alimony or court orders in place, but to really use that opportunity to reset, to create the boundaries that are going to help them be healthy and happy, to move to that next chapter in a way where it's going to be better than the previous 5 chapters. That's what really we're after. That's the difference. It's not about getting someone to the end. It's about starting them on their new journey. And I can tell all of your listeners that we have had so many, I'll just keep it to women, who have come in, they had no self-confidence, they had no self-esteem, they didn't know how to get out of the cycle, but they've done it.
Yeah.
And they've worked hard. And I run into them and we hug. But to watch these people transform to be the best version of themselves, not only is it possible, it's happening every single day.
Yeah.
So don't focus on how you feel now in the moment. Just know there's better days ahead, and know that you're in charge of yourself, your own emotions. And it doesn't mean it's not going to be hard. It doesn't mean it's not going to be painful. But sometimes out of the most painful situations come the most beautiful outcomes. And I've seen it every day. So you can do it. There's better days ahead.
Thank you for sharing that. And I can vouch for that too. I've seen a lot of women, and like we said, it does happen to men too, but a lot of people just really come out stronger and better and wiser, and it builds your empathy for other people. You can go and cry with somebody and you know what they're feeling, and that will end up being a gift in your life. So you will get through and your kids will be okay. I also want to advocate for being a little bit open and telling the teacher. You don't have to give details, but you can say, you know, we're going through a rough time, or our family is experiencing divorce. And it is nice for teachers to know, like, we can be even more sensitive and more empathetic for that child going through that. So thank you. I do always end with a scripture, and the one that was given to me years ago by a cute lady in my neighborhood. I don't even know why she said it, but it's in Matthew 10, but it's to be wise as a serpent and calm as a dove, which is really hard to do, those two things. But
Yeah.
I just think that we're in a time where there is a lot of deception and a lot of lies that happen in this world. And we have to kind of be really prayerful and ask the God above to help us, but to be wise as a serpent and as calm as a dove, I think is really good advice. So
Oh,
anyway,
it's wonderful. And one little saying, just on the spiritual side that I've heard and I keep in mind often is that two people can do anything if one of them's the Lord. So remember that as you're in your time of darkness and difficulty. You may
I
not
love
know
that.
how it's going to happen, but I believe very firmly that that's a true statement, and you can do anything, accomplish anything.
I believe that too. And God will get you through. He will. So Justin, thank you. And I do hope that you mean that you'll come back maybe next season.
I mean it. Yeah, I mean, when Melanie calls, I answer.
Well, you got a lot of calls, so there you go. Will you tell listeners how to find you?
Sure. If you need any help or just need a consultation, meaning you want to sit down and talk about your situation, we don't charge for consultations, as the first hour is free. So if
Okay.
you want to look us up, you can go to www.utah-lawfirm.com. That's our website.
Okay.
If you want to give us a call, our number is 801-866-0031.
I will add those links to the show notes. And if anyone out there is just struggling, just know there's great light and hope ahead. And so thank you, Justin Berube.
All right, Melanie, thanks again for having me. You're doing great work. Keep it up.
Thank you.
Thanks for being part of today's class. To submit a question or topic for further episodes, please email elementary.schooled@outlook.com. School is out for today, but please remember, when we strengthen a child, we strengthen society.